Much like Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, Valeria Luiselli's novel Lost Children Archive is a novel of spaces. The Borderland particularly figures as a prominent space, as both a destination and a space of conflict in this novel. What emerges is, as the novel tells it, is a strange country under a strange sky. So I want to take a few moments and think about the idea of borderland as space and the kind of borders that are crossed within this novel. The second section of the novel is introduced by a quote from the writer Gloria Anzaldúa, who died in 2004. As she writes here, a borderland is a vague and undetermined space created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. And so in Anzaldúa's writing, she thinks a lot about the sense of transition that happens within a border space as you move from one kind of defined space to another, and how are those two spaces on either side of the border kind of represented or overturned within the border space. How wide is a border space? It's an interesting kind of question to think about how that plays within the novel. In what ways do the characters here cross borders psychologically and emotionally, as well as physically and geographically here? And in what ways do they feel themselves kind of changed as they move from one space to another, as they move through these points of transit, as they travel across the United States and go south and west? As they travel, there's a question of when do they cross over into the West, right? That sense of a mythical region, the American West, which has its own history, its own set of mythic characters and figures. When you think about the American West here, is it a geographical or purely a mythical region in the end? I mean, where do you cross into it? Is it the Mississippi River? Is it the Rocky Mountains? Is there some other kind of arbitrary point in between where you go from the east to the west? Is it measured by the annual rainfall that a place receives? Is there a point where, as you receive less and less rainfall per year, you go further and further west, as some geologists would say? But you can also think about this West as a socioeconomic space or a political space or even a legally defined space, particularly in the novel's context, as border becomes a contentious space in which children are detained and deported and at points disappeared. And as this novel develops, do you think about Texas here as a space that's west or a space that's south? They're traveling southwest, right? But is Texas part of the West, or is Texas a part of a more kind of mythical American South here? How our narrator in this novel navigates that question is an interesting part of how you read it here. So you think about the West mythical geographies here first and how they are explored within the novel. You can think about the western desert as a wasteland here, as the narrator does. The wide open country now stretching out behind and beyond us as we drive deeper into some place. And so it becomes kind of a more and more remote space that they feel themselves entering as they travel west into desert, into spaces of wasteland, and throughout the drive. There's also kind of the historical weight of the place as well, right? As the narrator will think about the question when they stop at Fort Sill in Oklahoma at the Apache Cemetery, are they just chasing ghosts in a kind of mythical American West? Is it possible to kind of to recover that historical space, or is it gone? And so her husband, gathers sounds within that Apache Cemetery, as she just thinks about it as a soundscape in which Geronimo once was. Is it possible to go back into that West in its own time, or has that West disappeared? You can also think about West as a political space, one that in which a sense of control is maintained through force of arms, and this becomes kind of a point of uneasiness for them as they travel. The family travels further west. They when people ask them, kind of in friendly conversations about who are they, where are they from, and where are they going, kind of those questions become much more pointed, and the stakes of those questions grow as the narrator notes on 129. But the farther out we drive, the less these little truths and lies about us seem to appease people's need for an explanation. There are fleeting herds of border patrol cars. So how they account for themselves, how they describe their own identities, becomes much more kind of entangled with how this space of American West is a controlled space or not, as you read. You think about these against the ways they're told in the novel, the geographies that kind of develop here. These geographies here are driven primarily. If you've ever driven west or southwest, you'll know the kind of geographies that Luiselli invokes in this novel. Is kind of wide open spaces where you can see the weather from 3 days away, legendarily. The kind of spaces in which you can see a mountain range approaching, from a long way out, or thunderstorms that kind of hang on the edge of a western horizon. As she says, that these spaces are driven and a kind of entropy develops along long straight roads, empty and monotonous, that led us from Oklahoma through the northern tip of Texas and brought us to a stretch of concrete right off Route 66, which is the mythical highway, right? It goes from Chicago to California. It was kind of a route that was taken by a lot of people in migration west. And so it's a driven space that's west in this novel. It's also a narrated space. That means that it's told. It's told not only in the novel itself, but in the novel the book that she's reading herself and recording and having her son read later on in this novel, the Elegies for Lost Children. As she describes, as she reads the elegies, their stories, the children's stories, draw a single straight line moving up across the barren lands. The map would plot a single line, a thin crack, a long fissure, slicing the wide continent in two. And so she's thinking about how within the elegies, how the children are traveling on the train and how they're making their way up into their way north, and how this continent is split in two, not only geographically, but in other ways as well, economically, politically, socially, etc. It's also, you can think about the boundary geographies that emerge here as they approach the borderland. And so she thinks about the borderland here specifically as a line separating one nation from a no man's land, as a barbaric periphery whose chaos and brownness threaten civilized white peace. And so the borderland exists as kind of a mythical space that separates order from chaos. It separates one nation from all the chaos that it believes is on the other side of that boundary. And so the novel is pushing back against that way of thinking about boundaries and thinking about borders here. And these narrated geographies are really powerful in the end, right? The ways in which we tell stories that set up spaces, and the spaces, how they emerge from retellings of those stories, right? As Manuela tells her in giving her news about the two daughters who have been, have been detained by the Border Patrol, as she calls the narrator and says, Manuela was told that her two daughters would be transferred from the detention center where they had been waiting in New Mexico to another detention center in Arizona, from where they would be deported. But the day they were supposed to be transferred, they disappeared. And then it's within this moment, right, where the narrator, as she realizes the disappearance of the children, she makes the connection between Manuela's daughters and her own children here, right? And asks herself, would our own children survive in this space. And so it's a harsh question, which kind of drives and pushes her through the journey here, and then follows a course in which she seems to kind of psychologically come apart at points in the storytelling here. There are also these psychological boundaries that are crossed, particularly in the moment where the boy picks up the narration. They watch the children disappear on the plane, the children who are being deported, and he kind of picks up the story and kind of moves into an itinerant kind of adulthood here, right? He's thinking about this journey as the time we all lived inside the same map, and in what ways does that kind of come apart as the novel grows? In what ways does that world, that same map, dissolve in the boy's experience as they travel west here? And so in some ways he's not only crossing boundaries geographically, but he's also crossing boundaries of age and psychological boundaries in some ways, right? There are moments where he peers into an adult world and sees how that world works, and in ways that both interest him and also cause him a great deal of dis-ease. He's also, trying to become an adult himself in some ways, as he's building an archive for the girl, saying that he knows that she'll forget all this, she won't remember any of it, so he needs to build like a history collection for her. There's a moment where he sees his dad wearing his hat and his dad smoking, and he notes that he's smoking the way he smokes when he's worried. So he has that moment of like looking into the adult world and how it's kind of fraught with anxieties of its own. And then there's a moment in another sense in which he goes out to the car and he's looking in the box that his mother has put together, her kind of archival materials, the books and maps and reports that she's gathered there. Something came over me, he says, which I cannot explain. I felt like I needed to see what else was in that box. And when I went back inside afterwards, I felt like I was finally almost a grown man. And then you as reader get to see what he sees in the context of the contents of the box, the things his mother has gathered in box 5 on pages 241 to 257, so you can kind of leaf through them and kind of like engage his psychology directly as he tries to kind of put it together, and as he kind of moves into a world that is very different from the world of the child. So this is one of the interesting things is all the novels, all the boundaries that come undone in this novel, right? The psychological boundaries, the geographical boundaries, the mythical boundaries, political and social boundaries that are kind of dissolve in this journey west that the family takes, and as we move into this second section of the novel, there's also that sense of how these spaces dissolve in the ways in which their father wants them to come to know this space. As the boy knows, Dad said he wanted us to remember this land as a land of resilience and forgiveness, also as a land where the earth and sky knew no division. He didn't tell us what the real name of the land was, but I suppose it was Apacheria. So there's this mythical space that the father is trying to get back to, and in what ways does it either reflect or overturn an American West or a Mexican North here, if you want to read it that way? And in what ways, does the boy try to find a name for that land, and what boundaries does he cross as he tries to find that name? These are the tensions in the family's journey in this novel.